Доброго дня, шановні пані та панове. Український кризовий медіацентр розпочинає робочий день.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. We're happy to welcome those watching us online. We're going to start with a report from the UN Monitoring Mission. Let's have it from Matilda Bogner, the chair of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
Turn on the mic, please. The bottom.
Okay, good morning. Nice to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those present here today and those joining us online. Today we are launching our 30th regular report, which covers the period from the 16th of February to the 31st of July 2020. Much has changed since our last report, notably the novel coronavirus. The longer reporting period and new demands have resulted in us conducting a higher number of monitoring activities. The findings we present are based on verified information collected from 128 field visits, 5 visits to places of detention, 77 court hearings, 58 assemblies, and 906 interviews. In the midst of the pandemic, OHCHR recorded spikes in civilian casualties in both March and May this year. From the 1st of January to the 31st of July, OHCHR has recorded 107 civilian casualties. This includes 18 people killed, which is 10 men, 7 women, and 1 boy, 89 injured, 49 men, 30 women, 6 girls, and 4 boys, and which is a 10% decrease compared to the same period in 2019. Since the conflict started, the total death toll for civilians has reached at least 3,367, and more than 7,000 have been injured. During the reporting period, OHCHR began monitoring security incidents in the conflict zone that affected civilian objects, and will continue to do so going forward. From the 1st of January until the 31st of July, OHCHR recorded 75 such incidents, excluding civilian housing, and 41 of those resulted in damage to civilian objects. OHCHR welcomes the fact that the package of additional measures to strengthen the ceasefire from midnight on the 27th of July has significantly contributed to easing the effects of the conflict on the civilian population in both government-controlled and armed group-controlled territory. Since the 1st of August, we have not registered a single civilian casualty or damage to civilian objects resulting from the active hostilities. This demonstrates that it is achievable to have 0 civilian casualties. We urge parties to the conflict to continue to respect the ceasefire and to fully comply with international humanitarian law. OHCHR also welcomes the 2nd of September adoption of amendments to the Resolution 947 of the Cabinet of Ministers on compensation for civilian housing destroyed during the conflict. This establishes the procedure to follow for receiving compensation. The combined effects of the conflict and Covid-19 have been particularly difficult for those who need to cross the contact line. For these individuals, restrictions imposed on crossing the contact line in response to the pandemic have had a harmful effect. The sick people have had to struggle to access essential medical care. Families have been separated. Older persons already struggling to cross the contact line prior to the pandemic have been unable to access their pensions, and young people have had difficulty submitting their university applications. In one case, HRMMU was approached by a woman whose son, a single father, had died in Donetsk before she was able to see him. She was trying to reach her 2 grandchildren who had been left alone since his death in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. She feared that they would be taken to an orphanage, but she had been unable to cross the contact line to get to them. Parties to the conflict must ensure restoration of crossings with due respect to human dignity, to ensure that people can access basic services and enjoy their rights equally and without discrimination. We regret to learn that social protection departments in several regions have started requesting IDPs to renew their IDP status in person, despite the government suspending this requirement during the quarantine and for 30 days after. We have continued to document cases of arbitrary detention, torture and ill treatment in territory controlled by the government and in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics. The events that occurred at Kagarlik police station in Kiev region were well publicized. Efforts by the State Bureau of Investigation to investigate these and other allegations of torture and ill treatment are encouraging, but more needs to be done. We recommend ensuring the effective documentation and investigation of all allegations of torture in accordance with the Istanbul Protocol, and prosecution of alleged perpetrators, including persons in positions of command. We're concerned at reports by the Ombudsperson's Office highlighting the lack of respect for COVID-19 prevention and mitigation measures in the penitentiary system, which concurs with our own findings. As of 11th of September, there have been 120 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in penitentiary facilities, with 1 person having died. However, testing is very limited, so there may be more cases. In response to this, we urge measures to reduce overcrowding in prisons, in particular through the adoption of a draft amnesty law and increased use of non-custodial sentences. In territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, OHCHR continued to be denied access to detainees and places of deprivation of liberty. International organisations must be granted unimpeded access to places of detention as soon as possible. COVID-19 has also impacted the administration of justice in Ukraine. According to our survey of 121 lawyers, COVID-19 restrictions made it more difficult to access court registries, to hold confidential meetings with clients held in detention, and increased delays in trials. We also note with regret journalists' complaints that they have been unable to access court hearings since the quarantine began, even where court premises allowed for safe distancing. The absence of clear and unified rules allowing the public to observe trials is a matter of concern. Delays in conflict-related criminal cases have been further exacerbated by the 40% vacancy rate of existing judicial positions as of May 2020. Our recently released thematic report on human rights in the administration of justice in conflict-related criminal cases in Ukraine from April 2014 to April 2020 sets out these fair trial rights concerns in greater detail. As in previous reporting periods, we continued to monitor accountability proceedings in relation to the 2014 killings and violent deaths during the Maidan protests and in Odessa. While incremental progress is being made, justice is still lacking for victims. OHCHR also remains concerned about the lack of freedom of peaceful assembly in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics. Protests by coal miners about salary delays reportedly resulted in a series of arrests of participants. We note that in government-controlled territory, several Pride events have been able to go ahead since the end of the reporting period. Unfortunately, some of these and assemblies organised by political parties during the reporting period have faced violence. In several cases, the police, although present, did not intervene promptly enough to prevent violence. We are concerned that this, accompanied by impunity for attacks against journalists and political actors, as well as members of minorities such as Roma and LGBTI, creates a climate where more attacks can occur. Several physical attacks were recorded against journalists, and at least 3 others, 2 journalists and 1 political expert, received online threats and intimidation. The majority of these incidents, 5 out of 7, targeted journalists whose work focused on the authorities' response to the Covid-19 pandemic. 5 attacks were also recorded against LGBTI people and people perceived to be LGBTI. With local elections in October rapidly approaching, prevention of such attacks should be a high priority for the authorities. Prevention of violence helps to create an environment in which people feel secure to exercise their fundamental freedoms. On this note, OHCHR welcomes the adoption by the Central Election Commission of a procedure to facilitate voting by internally displaced persons and internal labour migrants. At the same time, the lack of progress in the elaboration of a law on the realisation of the rights of Indigenous people and national minorities is concerning. We welcome the approval of draft law number 2689 by Parliament on the 17th of September, which would pave the way for perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, crimes of aggression and crimes against humanity to be brought to account. We urge the Parliament to take steps required to adopt the law. However, we recall the need for the definition of torture to be modified in line with international standards and urge Parliament to add relevant provisions before the draft law is brought for consideration in the second reading. More generally, persons belonging to groups that are marginalised and in situations of vulnerability are at increased risk of being left behind during the Covid-19 crisis, as the pandemic often exacerbates existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. Groups like Roma, persons with disabilities who are living in the community, those living in homelessness or older persons, and persons with disabilities living in long-term care facilities already faced limited enjoyment of the rights to health, work, education, and an adequate standard of living before the pandemic and have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. We are also concerned to note the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women, in particular due to the increase in domestic violence. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol, Ukraine, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, we continue to document violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. We reported a pattern of reprisals against Crimean residents who resisted pressure from the Russian Federation, law enforcement authorities, and courts in Crimea to incriminate third parties. Courts also continued to pass judgment in apparent disregard of fair trial guarantees. The application of Russian Federation anti-extremism laws, commonly referred to as the Yarovaya package in Crimea, severely limits the manifestation of religious practices for some Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, Messianic Jews, and Hare Krishnas in the peninsula. Since the end of the reporting period, raids and searches have been carried out in the homes of several Crimean Tatars. This is part of a longer-term trend in which Crimean Tatars are disproportionately targeted by the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation and the police. Looking forward, we will be issuing an update on the human rights situation in Crimea in 3 months and then a full report after 6 months. It is clear that as we look forward, we don't see a rapid end to the COVID-19 crisis. While it is currently having a devastating impact on Ukraine and the world, it also presents an opportunity to build back better. To do that, we must place human rights up front and centre in our response to the crisis. Civil society, and in particular representatives of groups in vulnerable situations affected by the crisis, should be consulted during the design and implementation of COVID-19 response and recovery programs to ensure that no one is left behind. Finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of my statement, this is the 30th regular report issued by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission since 2014. We have also issued thematic reports. In each of our reports, we made recommendations aimed at improving the human rights of the people living in Ukraine. The recommendations are addressed to Ukrainian authorities, as well as self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic, and the Russian Federation as the occupying power in Crimea. I'm pleased to report that, according to our preliminary analysis, overall the Ukrainian authorities have partially implemented 60% of the recommendations addressed to them. We encourage the authorities to fully implement all our recommendations. On the other hand, the Russian Federation and the two self-proclaimed republics have not implemented nor partly implemented the large majority of the recommendations addressed to them. We call on them to further consider and implement the recommendations made by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission. Thank you.
Шановні гості, якщо ви маєте запитання до спікерів, прохання піднімати руки та
Okay, let me see if there are any questions. You're welcome to raise your hand and introduce yourself. If there are no questions, then would like to thank Matilda for this talk and would like to thank everybody for attention.